Um, my family were involved in the tragic Air India crash, and I request anyone listening to this who was of faith to keep them in their prayers. Um, but I'm really happy to have today Anwar, who I met uh, what would be about 18 months ago now, really. Just as I had started getting involved in the Muslim vote and it was getting set up, and we met at a conference, and we had a great conversation then. So I hope again we can replicate that. Uh, but we're nearly almost exactly 1 year to the date from the last general election, right? And me and you went out. We did some canvassing together. We've spoken to each other, and how do you reflect on the last, 360 odd days and the Labour Party's record? Is it better or worse than you expected?
Wow. Okay. So yes, I guess. Well, what was I expecting? I think when you think about the largest majority I've seen in my lifetime, it's much bigger than the Blair majority in '97. Whether you liked the Blair government or not, they had they'd actually made some significant changes in the country. Um, Tuition fee is clearly horrible, and it was actually the reason why I left Labour in '97 as the first generation to be hit by it. But they did tackle a massive NHS backlog. I mean, we've got a backlog right now, but there was a massive one back in the mid '90s as well. Um, Schools had massive amounts of investment put in. I went to one of the worst schools in the country, quite literally, one of the worst schools in the country, where the nicest kids from Brixton and Preckham attended, having been moved from all the other schools. I remember when I did my teacher training, I met somebody who was involved in the area, and their response was, schools like that don't exist anymore. And that was because of the then government that made these massive investments. We can't say that they didn't do any kind of good. Um, Significant people were a lot better off. I can't say that about what's happening with the current Labour government. They've got a much bigger majority than Blair ever did, significantly bigger. And of course, the other context to that is that actually, yes, I mean, that term sandcastle kind of has come about a bit, but if we explain that, is that they had this massive majority, not because they won it, but because the Conservatives lost huge numbers. And what happened was that Labour didn't lose as many. Labour did not lose as many. It's not as simple. In fact, actually, I mean, you mentioned we went out canvassing. In fact, the day before the election in Leicester South, and I said to you, like, I was not expecting Showkat to win at all. I was definitely, if all the Muslims came out to vote for Showkat, we still didn't necessarily have the numbers to take on Ashworth's numbers. That was the calculus. But I didn't realize how much people despised Labour that the non-Muslim community just didn't come out to vote for Ashworth. We had these anomalies, but of course in other areas they didn't have that option. And so Labour got in because there was no other option for people to vote, and there was no strong demographic like that we had in Leicester South. Of course, Leicester East, there was a whole bunch of other kind of like considerations. So anyway, that's the context. Is this massive kind of majority. What have they done? Now, I genuinely was kind of like, you can't drop the ball on this one. I mean, the Conservatives had a leader who got outdone by a lettuce, right? Like famously outdone by a lettuce. You can't get worse than this. All they had to do was add a few things around the edges, not really change much, and they would have been considered heroes. What did they do? They went massive majority. Let's cut the winter fuel allowance for old age pensioners. Let's stop the two-child benefit. Like, not stop, but let's not rescind that. They haven't gone back and rescinded the anti-protest laws, the anti-union laws. They've kept all of these things. Obviously, the disability cuts. And of course, I mean, who has benefited? their hedge fund millionaire friends, right? The hedge funds that have backed them. You could say, look, actually, what about the millionaires, farmers, right? We get a lot of them. There's that demonstration, and I did see a lot of comments within the socialist community saying they're going, well, you know what, we need equality in inheritance. But I see this as a real problem because farmers are workers, right? They just in order to be a farmer, you need a large amount of land and you need really expensive equipment. Just because you have that as something that's highly valuable, it doesn't mean you have access to that cash. They're really important parts of our community. And what they've cleverly done is they've attacked one group of workers and said to another group of workers that actually that lot is cheating you out. And they're cheating you out of your tax money that could be used for these disability cuts that we've had to cut because, there's this 20 billion black hole that we definitely didn't know anything about because we've been on the moon all this time, right? At the same time, they forget to kind of take on the billionaires and all those super rich who have their funds in tax havens. And we have an estimated 100 billion a year that's avoided in tax via these havens. So that's a $1 trillion black hole that we have, right? All these cuts that we're having right now. So I was listening to Jeremy Corbyn the other day, came down to Leicester, and he was talking about the 50% in cuts to support going to councils in Islington. 50% is huge, particularly when you take into consideration since 2010, that's all we've had. All we've had is cuts. So I'm actually really shocked at how quickly the Labour Party has fallen out of favour. It's a massive drop. It doesn't make any sense as to why they would need to do that at all. Borrow more money, slow the kind of way you would do it. It makes no sense. It's like they are on purpose trying to destroy themselves. It makes no sense, of course. The only promises they seem to have kept is killing Palestinians, right? They've kept their promises to the Israelis to support the killing of Palestinians. That's it. I've yet to see any promises that they've made to the rest of us. Whether it's the millions of houses that will have insulation, I haven't seen that. There's no access to it whatsoever. I haven't seen any drop in the energy bills. We're just seeing it go up instead. So, yeah, in a year's time, I'll be very clear. I did not like the Blair government, right? I was in the Labour Party as a teenager, and I was so peed off with them that when they came into power and introduced tuition fees, I was like, these guys aren't socialists, right? I left, and of course I campaigned, I protested against them and for the invasion of Afghanistan. Everyone talks about Iraq all the time, but Afghanistan was wrong, right? It was wrong from the beginning, right? And of course, the invasion of Iraq is suddenly when everybody thought, well, he's a terrible guy, right? It's been terrible, and there are lots of other things that they'd introduced. However, what is happening here is unprecedented. It's unprecedented. I don't think Blair could have gotten away with it. That's how unprecedented it is.
Yeah, and from my perspective, and if we take a bit of political economy into consideration here, is Keir Starmer wants himself to be the Tony Blair. Apart from he did not inherit the economy of Tony Blair. There is no growth in the economy. There is nothing, and he's inherited years of slashed services. He's inherited years of no investment into public services, and he just seems to want to carry on in this kind of neoliberal ideology that we've inherited from Thatcher's time. And I think that's where the criticism of Blair does come into play, where there was no change in ideological direction of this country. It was just a continuation of the status quo. with, important increases of spending in certain areas, but how that was managed, PFI, private finance being brought into the NHS, into our schooling, etc., was obviously a disastrous move, and we're still paying for it to this day. And yet, Keir Starmer seems to be insistent on continuing on that kind of same broken strategy. How do you think? So there's been argument made that in his first couple of years, and obviously I'm very young. I was born 2 years into Blair's premiership, right? So I don't remember this at all. But there was argument made that for his first year, Blair was very pragmatic. He didn't change too much, and then after his second and third year, as he started to grow the economy, that's when he introduced his more transformative legislation. That I know I personally benefited from, my family personally
Yeah.
benefited from. Um, do you buy that argument with regards to Keir Starmer?
All right. Okay. First of all, I'm not entirely sure that I buy that argument for Blair. Right? It's fairly one of the first things that they did, in fact, and this is some of these things go under the radar. So I'll give you a bit of background for myself, by the way, just the context. So I'm not just talking as just a layperson. So I am currently a chemistry teacher, but in a prior life, and certainly in the 2000s, I was an intelligence analyst, and so I worked in the financial services. And so I'm familiar with some. So I'm not an expert because it was biochemistry, that was my degree, but I'm familiar with this, and I followed this quite a bit as well. So one of the first things that they did was they decoupled the retail price index from the house price inflation. And of course, they handed over the control of interest rates to the Bank of England, which is a really good idea. That was a really good idea. But they hamstrung them straight off because they said, look, you have to control inflation, but not house price inflation. So despite not sounding like a big deal, this is huge because the massive change in the access to finance was because of this massive initial boom in the house prices was partly because of this, was fueled partly because of this. And also, I guess this was a little bit later, their policy in terms of the new EU countries that were coming in. The standard kind of, the context here was that they had completely open door policy, whereas they had the right to say, look, in the first year, we will have an X amount of people come in, second year, and it would be tapered. Every other European country, EU country at the time, did that. We were the only country that allowed that to happen pretty much instantaneously. And the consequences, coupled with this massive kind of access to really cheap prices, loan prices, plus massive influx in people where the jobs were. So this is in London. Prices rocketed. People were taking advantage of that high price. And so you now started to get the landlord culture, despite I've heard in previous comments, other podcasts, other socialists kind of suggest that landlords feel the inflation crisis. That's not the case. They came in afterwards. It was a symptom. They came in to kind of take advantage of that crisis that had taken place. So I would not argue that Blair's decisions early on were not instrumental. They just weren't sensational. That's the difference. But those key kind of like decisions, we are feeling the effects of. Like you said, PFIs, not necessarily sensational. And we're like, oh, brilliant, we've got access to doctors. But now we're in debt for generations to come, right? So it's the difference is where I'd argue is in the sensation kind of like position. So where Starmer is coming in is that they have no ideas. What you have to remember is that their main goal and idea was, how do we get rid of Jeremy? That was it. Once they've got rid of Jeremy, it's like, well, he's got zero ideas. How do we solve these crises? And the people that backed him, well, they're not the people that have the solutions or care about the solutions for the rest of society. The hedge funds actually benefit from crisis. They don't benefit from a better society. So they're not going to come up and provide solutions or insist on solutions that benefit the society. So I think we have to have that context of like actually what really is happening and how it's presented, and the information that we get to make our decisions about why somebody's doing well or not. Starmer, he's not a leader. He's a follower, and he's a useful idiot, as that term goes.
So, you know, Muslim Vote launched in the wake of October 7th. And there's always that argument that we only care about Palestine. You know, Anwar has spoken to me plenty of times. I think he can attest that that is definitely not the case. But even if it was the case, I think that the last week has shown why talking about Palestine is not only so important, but is a big litmus test. Because we've seen IDF slaughter hundreds of people almost every single day, right? At the same time, instead of discussing that, we're discussing some chant of a, fairly unknown artist at a music festival. We're discussing just random sideshows. And as Bob Dylan said in his statement, right, the story is not me. The story is not another band. The story is not Gary Lineker. The story is a genocide. And at the same time, we've had a High Court judgment which has basically said that the UK is allowed to continue selling parts of F-35s to the Israelis despite the ongoing genocide. And we've also had the British government now try to prescribe Palestine Action, who have been incredibly effective in disrupting the Israeli war machine. Again, are you surprised that the Labour Party have not taken the message of the 2024 general election on, or do you think that they are ideologically committed to the state of Palestine, not the state of Israel, and continuing, or are they just scared of being called anti-Semites like Jeremy Corbyn?
It's really difficult to put yourself into the mind of irrational people. Right? It is irrational, and what you've got to remember, and if you look at them, they're trapped. They're trapped. Nobody likes them, and the people that they had gone into bed with, they're snakes. So what do you do? I mean, you've got Wes Streeting the other day, kind of like coming out because he knows in his ward he's in danger, right? In his constituency, he's in danger of losing his seat, and he's saying that the Israelis need to get their own house in order. It's coming out with that. It's too late for him, right? And the others like Lammy and co, they know it's too late for them. There's no turning back. This is once you've committed this crime, you are now in it to the end. Because at what point now did you not know it was a genocide? So now you are going to carry on this genocide. And anybody who is potentially going to expose you or challenge you or send you to jail, because that's what they're heading for. There is no future for them. With Tony Blair, there was like, did he not, who had information, right? Like we don't have access to the dodgy dossier. That, forget the name of that doctor who mysteriously died, right? We don't know if he'd ordered it or not. We don't have access to that. We have plenty of access to the information of what the current government have, and in fact the previous government have, what was presented to them, what they knew, what they didn't know. There is no case that they can present to say, hey, we didn't know a genocide was happening. We were just, innocently handing over weapons of mass destruction to this crazy state. They can't say that. They're now committed. They're fully committed. So we have to understand someone who is fully committed. The only way that they might come out of it is to say, hey, look, I want some kind of deal where I get less of a sentence. That's the only way they are. So that's the position that they're in. And so they're not going to win it, but they're not going to win that back by going, oh, do you know what? We'll put on sanctions now. And if they do, their mobster friends in the Israeli government and the American government are going to come back and they're going to kneecap them, right? That pun was on purpose. That's what will happen to them. They know that they're going nowhere, so they've got no choice. So in this regards, we can't necessarily kind of think of necessarily changing their minds. It's not going to happen. The other thing to remember is that the history of colonialism isn't new. Churchill, in his younger days, campaigned for the invasion of Sudan and the slaughtering of Sudanese. And he promoted them as savages, as his justification for slaughtering and invading Sudan. This is no different. This is no different. The hatred towards brown people, Muslims in particular, is centuries old. It is centuries old. And so, yeah, we can't look to Labour to think, okay, you know, what will they do? How will they change? You know, what are they thinking? They're thinking, you know, we're in it. How do we avoid a jail sentence? Because it is coming to them, right? At some point, that's coming to them.
Yeah, and I think what's so dangerous about the actions they're taking towards Palestine Action is, I think this would be the first direct action group that has been prescribed under these very broad anti-terrorism laws, and it takes away the power of organizations like Just Stop Oil or others to take very important, very much needed direct action. I know people have different opinions on the efficacy or on the media impact of direct action. I think history will show us that direct action is always the most powerful form of action. That's my personal opinion. Obviously,
Well,
you're free to
let
disagree.
me throw this in too. Now, one of the things that we often see is that we'll often get people promoting, say, Martin Luther or Gandhi's approach, the peaceful protest, the quietly, very dignified kind of protest where, you know, they'll come at you with batons and you don't say boo to a goose. And Malcolm X, the ballot or by bullet. No, well, this is too much. These are savagery. These are obviously, you know, this is a terrible kind of thing. I remember, and actually, I got this from a Norman Finkelstein kind of interview, and he was quoting Gandhi because we constantly are expected to be like Gandhi in this. And he was asked, what do you think about those people? And I'm paraphrasing. What do you think about those people who take up arms against the British? Right? And his response was, if you were unable to endure the hardship of his method of peaceful protest, and it was hardship because you would be brutalized. You'd be absolutely brutalized. So we're asking people to allow themselves to be absolutely brutalized and not respond in any kind of negative way. If you are unable to do that, he said, you should pick up an AK-47. I'm not advocating this, so the CIA is watching, right? I'm just saying this is what Gandhi said. So when we refer back to, and when we are saying we should be like these people, actually, what we should do is we should hear the entire context. In fact, one of my students I was talking to about that, because I did a podcast on Transform and invited Larch Maxey, who's one of the Just Stop Oil members who is incarcerated with Roger Hallam and co. He was released on probation with a tag recently, so we had him on there. And I said, I'm going to be doing a podcast with him. And her response was, oh, those guys, that's, yeah, I mean, I understand the cause, but I don't agree with their method. And I said to her, well, look, what about the suffragettes? I asked her about the suffragettes, and she said, no, they were peaceful. And this is the interesting about history. It is so sanitized that young girls, and she's actually quite politically kind of active, young people believe that we attained our freedom through passive protests. The march in 2003 that I went on to against the war, there was 1 million people who marched. They completely ignored us. So tell us again how passive protests actually work. They don't. I don't actually go on marches anymore. Right? I stopped after that. I'll be honest. I don't go on marches. I think there are other methods. There are other peaceful methods. I do advocate peaceful approaches. That's my thing. There are other ways in which we can engage. I mean, we might talk about some of those later, but I'm not going to condemn comrades in Just Stop Oil or Palestinian Action. I think anybody who does needs to have a word with themselves, because history has shown time and time again that that doesn't work. And we know as Muslims the history of our of the Prophet, right, and his seerah. We know that it wasn't a passive movement. The Prophet struggled for decades of abuse until at one point we were allowed to defend ourselves when it was too much. So as Muslims, we know, and I take this to heart. You know, the Prophet said, I'm terrible. I can't quote you the exact, quotation from the Hadith, but I'm sure we all know this. When we see wrong, our first duty is to stop it by using our hand. Our second is with our mouth, and the least is to curse it in our hearts. And this is the very least. I'm sure. I'll probably mourn that a little bit, but to me, I take that to heart. I take that to heart. We have a duty. We have a duty to intervene. And just because we are safe and we are comfortable today, our duty is to intervene as much as we can. And we intervene not just with the oppressed, but we intervene to help the oppressor, just as the Prophet said, to stop oppressing, because that is also help. That's what we should be doing. So we have a duty to be honest. We have a duty to respect the history of revolution and those who have fought and died for us. And I'm not talking about soldiers who've gone on to foreign countries, and I'm not even talking about the soldiers who fought the Nazis, because they weren't fighting for us. Yeah, Gandhi was in prison during the Second World War because he dared ask for freedom from the British, who were oppressing us. So, this is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about those people who actually stood against governments to say, hey, I want my local people. I want our communities to have rights. I want my comrades here to have enough money to pay for their food, to live, to be sustained. I want for my brother, for my neighbors, what I want for myself. These are the things. And for those of you who say, look, what kind of socialism is this? It's like, this is Islam, right? This is Islamic values that we need to be espousing. Sorry, I talk too much.
Yeah, and I think it's really important that we expose and that there's a universal values that we do aim to see. And sometimes we say justice in kind of an empty way. We don't really know what we're talking about. But I think at the heart of justice on a human level is dignity. What I want is Palestinians to wake up in dignity. I want my neighbors to not have to worry about their energy bill, or whether they can afford to put the heating on in the winter, or whether they can feed their kids and themselves on the same day. I don't want them to have to worry about that. I want people to wake up and live their lives in dignity. Everyone's going to have struggle. I don't believe in a utopia, but I do believe that basic dignity is possible, and that is what we should strive for. And with regards to PAL action and suffragettes and action of direct action in this country, very importantly, they target infrastructure, they target assets, they do not target humans, right? And if you think it's immoral to destroy a factory which makes bombs or makes plane parts, or contributing to the genocide of Palestinian children, then I think you should really look at yourself hard in the mirror. Now let's move on to kind of the final topic we're going to discuss, because like I said, we always have brilliant discussions and we're slightly overrunning. It's about a new party. Right now there's tons of speculation out there. I don't really want to talk about that. What I do want to talk about, a couple of questions I want to ask you is, do you believe there needs to be a new party, or has Zach Palensky convinced you that the Greens and him can be the face of a future left? And secondly, what does the future left look like with regards to principles? And final question is, can that party mobilize and become an effective force for change within the next 10 to 15 years?
Wow. Okay. Yeah. So Zach Polanski, for me, that's an easy question, actually. If I thought Zach Polanski and the Greens were it, I would have joined them already. In fact, I considered that when I started to get more active again. Again, this was pre-October 7th. But the issue there for me is that we need to be really careful. First of all, there's a history of Zach Polanski you need to be really careful of, right? I consider him a bit of a I would like to say that people have the ability and the right to change and to be. So I'm very much open to the fact that he might have changed his views over the years. However, he was very happy to attack Jeremy and lay claims of anti-Semitism against him. He used weaponized anti-Semitism against him when it suited him. This was in was it 2019? Now, apparently he's apologized. I'm not entirely sure it was an apology, or might have done so in private, but it seems to me rather convenient. So I'm cynical, and he would need to earn back my trust. However, if we put Zach Polanski to one side, and I say, well, look, if you have to elect somebody with a conscience, with socialist principles, it's not a socialist party. If you have to elect someone in that, you are not in a socialist party. And recently, there was some kind of hype around an 8% increase in the number of people joining the Greens. Great. What about the other 90%? Right? Just because there's been a massive influx, and actually a lot of those people have come in just to vote for him, and they're not necessarily the Greens. Right? What about all the other people? And you've got to remember the history of the Greens. The Greens is not, they've come about as a climate activist party, not as a party for the poor, not as a party for social mobility, for justice, for economic justice, for social justice. That's not necessarily the case. For example, they're for NATO. NATO is a pro-colonial program. It is there set up to oppress colonies. They talk about it being about anti-Russia, but we saw what they did in Afghanistan and Iraq, right? So we have to remember who they really are as a whole, not just the one or two media darlings. Caroline Lucas thinks she's brilliant, but she did not represent the whole of the Green Party. She didn't even represent the whole of the Green Party in Brighton. I spent many years in Brighton. They were horrendous. The Green Party has right now in Bristol, famously it's gone green. The Green Party are introducing £51 million worth of cuts. So look, I spoke to the local Green candidate here in Leicester, and which we both know, and she made some really good points as to why she'd want to stay in the Green Party, and I think that's fair enough. There are some good reasons to do it. I'm not saying that they are the worst party in the world, but they are not what we're really looking for. They just happen to be there because they're the only option around at the moment. So this kind of leads on to the next bit. It's like, well, I'm pretty sure I remember the question, which is about how do we, what does a new party kind of look like? Well, it looks like, and it has to look different. It can't look like any of the other parties. And I keep hearing people talk about grassroots. I hear that all the time, like politicians and comrades who I'm sure are sincere, but in practice, I don't see it. I don't see grassroots activism. Now, what I see is people telling me what I should believe, telling me that this is the way it should be done, as opposed to what are your views and how can we, and we were discussing this earlier, How can we serve the community what they actually need? So, for example, in this coming week in Leicester, we are going to start the first of our citizen assemblies. Right, Shaukat Adam is going to be there to do a little kind of intro speech, and so is Claudia Webb and a couple of other people. But the speeches are going to be very little. The actual model that we're going to be looking at is, and actually showing people as part of this process, we have to show people, is that we'll go into breakout groups, and in each of these groups, we will ask a simple question. What is important to you, perhaps? What is important to your community, and what maybe is important nationally or internationally? Come up and discuss that within your groups. Now, these are things that also should be things that we can realistically act upon as well. Then we're going to bring that back to the whole group to have a discussion on and vote on which ones are going to be our priorities that we can act upon as a community. We're not going to take it away, give it to somebody else. We as a community have to act upon it. And then discuss about, well, how do we have a community that can do and take these challenges on going forward? What we can't do is leave it to individuals who have the opportunity to perhaps run for local government, etc. We have to give that power and that voice to the community, to those people who struggle to be heard, right? And I had one of our co-organizers. She's really kind of adamant that we've got to try to make sure that particularly Muslim women who might not find it easy to speak out in these groups, we must find ways in which we can give them voice. So we have to actively look at strategies to say, hey, look, I haven't heard from that person. Let me go and find out. Let me go and find out. And actually, I remember listening to a brother, I'm pretty sure it was from Bristol, and he was talking about, well, look, we haven't got all these groups in around the table. We need to go to them. Don't just send an invite. Let's go to them and find out. And I think this is a really good attitude. We have to actively go to our community, our neighbors, and say, hey, I didn't see you at this assembly. Are you okay? What are your needs? Let's start doing this. We need a model that does this. Now, your final question about can this work? Well, I'll tell you really interestingly. So we're doing this thing in Leicester South. It's going to be in the center of the city. But where I am on the outskirts, I was just talking to a few of the parents there, and they're like, we're really interested in doing this here locally. They're really up for it. It excites people. And what really excites people is being heard. I don't want to go, and alhamdulillah, it was a really good event right, on Saturday. Jeremy came down to support Shaukat. They had a Q&A session, right? It was, honestly, it was a well choreographed event, right? But I didn't come away thinking, well, there's going to be this action that comes out of it. I didn't come away feeling that actually members of the community know what to do next. And so, yes, there was an opportunity to speak and to speak to members, to people with power, but actually it needs to be different. It needs to be different. And I love what Shaukat's been doing, by the way. He is going to the community. He is listening to people. But we need to develop strategies that really empower people. So we're not hoping Shaukat solves all our problems for us, that we are empowered to do it ourselves. And that's really exciting. And that really gets people into the room and it gets people doing things. So will it take 10 to 15 years? I'll give you an interesting example from your own conference. I'm pretty sure, whether it's yourself or somebody else, you were talking about the Muslim Vote Project's kind of long-term goals with these multiple cycle goals. The fact that we ended up with 4 independent MPs, Muslim independent, I'm not counting Jeremy in this. He was a separate issue. We got these 4 independent MPs, plus so many others who are so close. Tells you that, yes, maybe we could have realistic 15-year cycles, but actually there's a massive appetite that if you tap into properly and you give people voice properly, as the Muslim community was able to have, we can translate that to the white working class community, to the Afro-Caribbean communities and all the other demographics out there. You can have a sea change, right? But it requires people to actually want that.
Absolutely. And like I've insisted to people all across the country, we believe we're one section, one segment of a solution to this country. The problems in this country. We believe that Muslims can be a positive influence for change alongside trade unions, right? This is a moment for trade unions to step up, alongside community groups, alongside groups who have just been ignored for years. I always tell people I understand why the white working class may vote for reform, because they have been kicked and kicked and kicked and ignored and ignored and ignored to such an extent that their kids perform at the worst levels in schools, and they're
Mhm.
still ignored. And then they're told white privilege, white privilege, white privilege. There is no privilege in no opportunities, poor education, poor access to healthcare, dirty streets, having a HMO, like 12 HMOs on one street, or poor access to waste management facilities. There is no privilege in that. And the fact that these individuals are now told that their only solution, the only alternative narrative they're hearing are from reform. And, it's our job as organizations like the Muslim Vote, maybe a new party, the Green Party, the left, whoever it might be, to provide a compelling narrative that the problem is not your neighbor or a poor refugee coming over in a dinghy, but the billionaires and the millionaires who are, taking from our NHS, whose money, our social housing money, £7 billion a year go to, no, £7 billion in the next 5 years, sorry, will go to private renting accommodation. That should be reinvested into making social housing for people that need it. So yeah, before I wrap up, Emma, is there any kind of last comments you'd like to leave?
It's really hard sometimes. I mean, I try to avoid watching the news, I've got to be honest, because it's really hard. And we know it's really hard to watch what is happening. I'm someone that wears my heart on my sleeve, and I can't watch. And I have kids at the age of that are being slaughtered in Palestine. It is really hard to watch this happen, and it's really easy to feel like there's nothing that can be done. And it's really easy to be frightened. Oh, Palestine action has been, prescribed. These people are being put in prison. These people are being shut down. These people have to tiptoe around. It's really easy to go, you know what? Let me just go into my little corner. But that poem by Martin, I always forget how to pronounce his surname. He's a Lutheran priest who said, "When they came for the communists, I did not speak for them because I was not one of them." And of course, it goes on and on. Eventually, they came for me, and there was no one left for me. Right? No one was left to speak for them. So look, if you're comfortable, if you think, well, actually, do you know what? Let me just buy that can of Coke because it's there, right? If you're comfortable, remember, they will come for you eventually. It is coming. They will come for you. After 9/11 happened, and I started kind of like getting Islamophobic abuse, literally that evening, right? Being called a terrorist as I was walking down the high street in Brighton. When I started saying, "Hey, look, Islamophobia is a real thing," and people say, "No, you're just using a card," right? They're coming for every single group, right? They're coming for the trans community, and you might think, "Well, I'm not trans. Why should I speak? Why should I not speak up for them?" They're coming for you, and every person that might have stood with you, you didn't speak for them, and you didn't say they have their rights as we have ours, right? And we should stand for their rights as we stand for ours. Unless we do that, they will come for us, and you will deserve it. That's what I would say. So we need to stand, and we need to be ready to recognize that others have rights as we do. And we need to stand in solidarity. That's what that term means. Solidarity with all oppressed peoples all over the world. That's what we need to be doing. And that's where I'll leave it. Jazakallah for
Okay.
having me on the show.
Jazakallah. Inshallah, we'll catch up soon. Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum.